Hello, this is Greg Best and Bryan Moynihan, and we will be talking about the Native American flute and its transition into modern-day hip-hop. As much of music is created to tell a story or depict an event, the Native American flute has been very instrumental to our music society as a whole. The Native American flute is characterized by having a very soft melodic tone and incorporated slow, steady notes that gradually grow faster and more emphatic to tell a story or build a scene. As much of hip-hop is created by sampling and the beat is the main thing that draws the listener in, the Native American flute is quickly becoming a very popular instrument when composing this style of music. Many famous hip-hop composers such as Melly Mel, Jay-Z, Jurassic 5, and DJ Shadow have used samples of the Native American flute to help build the beat and add an unusual and unique element to their music. The Native American flute has been around for many generations, with the oldest documented instrument dating back as early as 1823, when it was founded by the Italian adventurer Giacomo Costantino Beltrami. This flute was constructed from a single piece of western red cedar that had been bored out rather than split and glued. The end of the instrument was made to resemble a fish mouth, as it was very common for Native Americans to honor the animals they relied on to survive. Legend has it that the first flute was created as woodpeckers would put holes in hollow branches looking for termites, and as the wind would blow past them, it would create a sound or peaceful tone. The sound was so peaceful and distinct that the native people strived to recreate this sound, and this gave birth to the Native American flute. The two most common styles of Native American flutes were the plains flute and the woodlands flute. The plains flute was the most popular style of flute created, as it had two air chambers with a wall inside to separate them. In between the two chambers was a whistle mechanism with an external block that regulated the air flowing through the instrument to create a very distinct sound. This external block creates a narrow stream across the second hole, which is covered, and then goes back through the main tube and passes through the 6 opening holes to create as many different types of sounds, tone, and pitch. The plains flute was distinctly created for the person who would be playing the instrument, as the length, space between the holes, and design were customized for the individual. The average plains flute would have a length of the distance from the inside of the elbow to the tip of the finger of the person who owned the instrument. The first chamber would have the distance of 1 fist from the mouthpiece. The distance from the whistle mechanism to the first hole would be 1 fist. The holes themselves would be 1 thumb apart from the distance from the last hole to the end would be 1 fist also. In addition to the top holes, there were 2 holes on the other end, which were used as tuning holes to make the flute sound like a shorter instrument. The native people would then generally carve the end of the flute to resemble some animal they respected and loved, as Native Americans were typically one with the land. These instruments were typically made of river cane, bamboo, or local wood, as softer wood created a softer tone. In Native American culture, the flute was a very powerful instrument, as it was typically played in very personal settings without accompaniment of any other instruments during the times of courtship, healing, meditation, and spiritual rituals. The Native American people were very group-oriented, and during spiritual gatherings, they would play the flute to give the people a sense of togetherness and serenity. In modern culture today, the flute is played solo in the beginning of musical compositions, but most often it is accompanied by other instruments, vocals, or background tracks.
The Indianist movement began to showcase Native American musical traditions, and the flute was a main part of their music. From about 1890 through the 1920s, American classical composers started borrowing Native American musical themes and synthesized them with Western classics in the musical form. Some of the more popular composers who paved the way for the integration of Native American music in modern society were Charles Wakefield Cadman, Arthur Farwell, Charles Stanford Skilton, and Arthur Nevin. Although these revolutionaries paved the way for Native American music in modern culture, the Native American flute nearly went extinct, as many attempts were being made to eradicate indigenous cultures and assimilate them into our modern culture. During the 1940s, the policies towards Native American cultures began to soften, and the flute traditions resurfaced. In an amazing collaboration between cultures, Native American flute players as well as enthusiasts from outside of Native cultures were influential in supporting this rebirth. In the late 1960s spurred the Roots revival. centered around the flute, with a new wave of artisans such as Doc Tate, John Rainier Jr., Sky Walking-Stick Manalone, and Carl Running Deer. In the 1980s and early 1990s, several trends and events caused an explosion of awareness and respect in the Native American flute, paving the way for the American flute to become integrated into hip hop. As hip hop and the Native American flute were both becoming very popular in the late 1980s to 1990s, edgy musical composers decided to try integrating samples of the Native American flute into their songs. The first and most well-known for doing this was Melly Mel, who's a Cherokee and created the term MC. Since Melly Mel's work came out very well and sounded good to many others followed his lead and incorporated the Native American flute to their hip-hop tracks, as it has been very rhythmic and adds an element that is very easy to build up. Melly Mel was a pioneer for blending Native American music, particularly the Native American flute, with hip-hop beats, and many others have continued to follow in his footsteps, such as Jay-Z. Currently, DJs are very popular, and many people like to blend different types of music, and they tried creating this by adding the Native American flute. When listening to hip-hop these days, keep your ears open because you probably won't notice it, but the Native American flute is incorporated on a constant basis.